I, as you may be aware, am the chairperson of ASPROM, the sibling organisation to BAMM. We are slightly older. We celebrate our 40th anniversary this year, but I believe you celebrate your 20th next year, so you're catching up. You might notice one small difference to my title for those of you with eagle eyes. There is a question mark, bringing the classical to contemporary mosaics question. And I believe that there is some justification required, partly, for me, why am I standing here? What am I doing on a Saturday afternoon? But more importantly, what does the classical bring to bear when it comes to the contemporary, or vice versa? And I think today I've tried to think a little bit about the themes of this forum, and you can see those coming up in bold. I want to very briefly try to explore and communicate to you some of the continuities and contexts between ancient and modern, classical and contemporary, in terms of medium and meaning, form and function, production and practice. And all of this, I hope, will exist within the spectrum of ideas and imagination. From there, I hope to move on to thinking a little bit about the value in collaborating and creating what scholars and others now call communities of practice, and also networks of learning and knowledge. Everything that I'm going to do, hopefully in the next half an hour, is going to be thoughts, is going to be fragments of ideas. And I think one theme that I think you might note, and you'll see coming up again, is that between the ephemeral and the permanent. An issue that I think has great resonance both within mosaic and the making of mosaics, and also within sort of our human activities. And it is very humbling in many ways to stand here and give, what is, in some ways just a sort of ideas talk, when I've seen so many brilliant community projects presented today that really go out into the public realm and engage with communities to bring mosaic to them and to collaborate on their production. So I think much of this is sort of small things that I think about when I sit in my office, when I work with my students and other people. And I guess also there's a question here of how we might collaborate, create and communicate better. And I just pose that, really, from my small, siloed academic position. So, naturally, I begin with Pliny, with his discussions of a famous mosaic made by Sosus, a Hellenistic Greek practitioner working at Pergamum, an ancient city in modern Turkey, making extraordinary mosaics for the Attalid kingdom. Pliny talks of a mosaic, probably one, maybe two, in particular, one that he labels in Greek the asaroton oikon, the unswept room, and another that he refers to as a mosaic of doves. What is extraordinary about these is that they're made by a particular individual, that they are somehow brilliantly executed, high virtuoso skill, and they do something extraordinary in relation to two-dimensional surfaces and the creation of three-dimensional space. The one on the left, just briefly to explain or to sort of extrapolate some ideas around that. This is a version of the unswept room from Rome. It represents the remains of a dinner in a super realistic manner, and is a brilliant play on the idea of the medium of mosaic and the fundamental meaning and play that it is doing. And I think playfulness as well is a theme that I will return to again. It is so laid in a dining room. often in an area exactly where tables were positioned for food. So food, real food, in the process of dining gets intermingled with this imaginary food. So there is an interaction between activity and the representation on the floor. In addition, you have participants who are engaging with that food, who are looking at this floor, and in the slow course of drinking, eating, and listening to music, discussing and so forth, may, in that process, get confused about the relationship between what is real and what is imagined. But further, that food being cleaned between meals may require servants or slaves to come in and wash down that floor, and in the process themselves become an object of laughter, perhaps, as they are unable to properly clean that floor of the rubbish which is actually both on top of it but mosaicked within it. So in a very strange way, something that is essentially ephemeral, something which is the remains of a dinner, the rubbish from a party, is elevated to become permanent through the skill and, let's say, the genius of our Hellenistic mosaicists. But it's also indicative of a particular moment, the present moment of dining, but can also reference future events and past ones. So in a way, it can exist at a liminal point between past, present, and future. A sort of perpetual performance or celebration of dining within a dining room. So on many levels, it is a very clever, very knowing thing. We can go back in time and we can actually go to Pergamum and we can see the mosaics that were created there. And this is one made again by a Greek person, a Greek craftsperson called Hephaestion, who has left his name inscribed on the mosaic. Hephaestion epoie. Hephaestion made it. And this is again on an ephemeral thing. It is a mosaic in stone, but it is on a piece of parchment, waxed down at each corner, but one corner curls up as the wax comes away, and you see below the parchment. That in itself is a visual trick, it's a game, but parchment is something that was invented by the Attalids in the 2nd century BC because they were having an intellectual competition with the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, and the Ptolemies had decided that they were no longer going to supply them with papyrus. So the Attalids made parchment in response to this so that they can continue to develop their library and demonstrate their own intellectual credentials. So it plays on time, it plays on material, but material specific to place, but material again that is ephemeral but made permanent. My third example of this trope is a mosaic that comes from North Africa, this time somewhat later. Let's advance a few hundred years and position ourselves in Carthage, in the house of the Cryptoporticus, where at some point in the 3rd century AD, they renovate part of their house, and in a small room in the rear of the property, they lay this mosaic. A mosaic that is exactly what you see. It is a skin of a wild beast. It is a tigress, and we know that it is a female by the pelt itself. And it is super realistic. It has no frames, it has no borders to mediate it. It is left lying in the middle of a white tessellated space. It is, again, an extraordinary visual conceit in a virtuoso technique. And it is generally thought, or some people think that it's some sort of exotic hunting trophy, perhaps containing apotropaic powers, the powers to ward off evil because of associations to Dionysus. Dionysus often rides on the back of tigresses. They are particularly fierce, known to be particularly fierce, and written about in antiquity for exactly that reason. But this is laid out on a floor, and presumably, again, you're meant to walk in and you're meant to see this luxurious thing. Tigers only exist in the east, so it has to have come from a significant distance. You can't hunt these locally in North Africa. But the whole process of producing a pelt requires significant amounts of time and effort to process them, and of course are soft and luxuriant things. So again, we have something, a skin turned into stone, made permanent through that process of petrification. And that process of petrification, just as in turning a real pelt into, a real skin into a pelt, is one that takes time, knowledge, effort, and so forth. And all of that is imbued with the thing itself. Time within the object. Of course, all of these mosaics exist to be engaged with by people who will experience them. By that I mean the obvious, that mosaics need to be activated in order to function in the way that they are intended. So a human participant is required. So this one on the left is a very nice one from Spain, Dionysiac image that hides within it a double image. So as you walk over it, the young Dionysiac rural male holding a pedum, a stick for hunting small animals, turns into an old bearded man holding a tympanon, a sort of tambourine type. So you switch between them, much like comics of the 20th century played with too. So that activation is important, that experiential way of moving around mosaics. And a lot has been said, I think, today also by people about narrative, about engagement, about walking and seeing and looking, and that experience of a mosaic. And as I've said, mosaics are not just activated, but they capture things. They are petrifications of real ideas, but have real purposes. So in this Medusa mosaic on the right-hand side, Medusa being a mythical creature whose gaze could turn you to stone, in a way, this is her power being harnessed. I mean, in a way, it could be seen as a joke, partly a joke, of Medusa herself, who turns other people into stone, is herself turned into stone. But in the process of doing that, you also harness her powers. And her powers here are visualized in the geometric border around that moves as you look at it, but also as you walk around it. So this is the literal power of her gaze in geometric form. And that visual aspect is very important because, our eyes are very easily fooled, but also through these geometric types of arrangements, we can, let's say, affect human perception and change the way that you see the world around you. So these things, in a way, both change your perception, but demand to be touched, walked upon, and activated. Now, this brings me to sort of, a slight side track, but an important one, because when I was thinking about, what does the classical bring to contemporary mosaic, Well, I'm very fortunate to have an excellent colleague in Michael Squire who is running a project called Modern Classicisms. And in this, he poses a series of questions that I'll very quickly read out to you. So he says, what is it about ancient Greek and Roman art that still captivates and provokes the modern imagination? How can contemporary art help us to see the classical tradition with new eyes? And what can modern-day responses, set against the backdrop of others over the last 2 millennia, tell us about our own cultural preoccupations? Which, in a way, brings us back to those questions of continuities and contexts. And this is explored through a workshop, all of which is online, much like BAMM's brilliant back issues, let's say, on YouTube, where you can go back and look at those talks. And so the mics are here, and I just wanted to very quickly, play this game with a very famous Turner Prize-winning artist like Mark Quinn, who's one of the people who attended this workshop. And it made me think last night when I was standing and someone said to me, I wonder whether anyone making mosaic will ever win the Turner Prize. And I guess there's a question, I think this has clearly got to be one of the key aims of BAMM over the coming years, and I task you with that. But I guess the question here, there are issues here that also play into exactly these ideas of what does the classical bring. And you'll be very familiar with Alison Lapper, Pregnant, the marble sculpture produced by Mark Quinn with the Carrara marble carvers, and also Breathe, this extraordinarily different but same version of Alison Lapper Pregnant, which was shown at the opening ceremony of the Paralympics. And in this dialogue between my colleague and Mark Quinn, they talk a lot again about how ancient art and contemporary art have the same ideas of, especially in the public realm, of questions of civic celebration, particular thinking about past, present and future, all of which for Mark Quinn was very much bound up in the Alison Lapper, the celebration of a woman, the celebration of a woman who was pregnant, and therefore also looking to the future. But also this collapse in time to the past because of Alison Lapper's body shape, recalling that of the Venus de Milo, for example. So these connections going back into the classical past and then into the present moment. And in that interview, Mark Quinn says something quite sensible about and telling about the importance of a truly great artwork always being in the present moment. And I think, some of these objects that I'm showing you that are from our classical past but are very contemporary still have the ability to surprise us, to engage us in ways that does make them classics. And I guess that is what we're aiming for also with our contemporary art. So just to show you some pictures, if you remember this is it being carved in the Carrara quarries. And here is the Breathe set up, both Paralympics and then reset up in Venice for the Biennale there. And just to show you, that's why it's Breathe. This is an inflatable version, somewhat larger than the original stone. And in that sort of inflatable version, it also, for Mark Quinn, asks a series of questions about the necessary infrastructures that need to exist for this inflatable version to exist itself, power and so forth, and also the notion of the fragment and the ephemeral. This inflatable version clearly requires that airflow to keep it pumped up. And in response to that, my colleague talks about that power of classical art in its incompleteness, which allows us to recast it afresh, both imaginatively and emotionally. So a lot of, clearly what we take from that past is fragmentary and then negotiated through Romanticism and so forth to the present day. But it asks questions precisely of the fragmentary nature of antiquity, but also of our own fragmented nature, which Mosaic in its essence is very well set up to deal with, of course. You've all seen, I guess, the Casa Ceramica stuff that sits very neatly with the sort of Pompeian material. I've got the videos, but maybe I can go over these. But this is clearly a flat surface over which you walk, and it's the tiles and the laying of those tiles that gives you this effect that the floor is actually undulating. And these videos that you can watch show you them walking. And there may be less of the meaning, more of the medium being played with here, and simply, the two-dimensional and three-dimensional surface. But it's a very clever play. Here it is turned around. The important thing here is about the axis of your experience. So when you walk in, that's what you see. So it's important that when you walk in, it is all undulating. But when you walk out, well, you know it. You know the answer. So it's okay to walk out. And this is the flat surface that then creates the illusion. And I just want to briefly focus on one artist who I'm very fortunate to have met, and is a friend of mine who many of you probably will know or have heard of, Jim Bakker, an American artist who studied very briefly in northern Italy, took a mosaic course, became completely obsessed with it, went back and excavated in Pompeii, and his mosaics have very interesting classical resonances. These two, the Evidence series, where he sort of plays with ancient-looking mosaics, but have just little touches that when you look closely or just you slowly recognize that these are obviously not ancient mosaics. This one even, he says in his blurb, ask me about the story of this piece surviving being run over by a car, which plays again on this sort of damaged, fragmentary nature. Even perhaps it plays for me also a little bit on the art market, and the fact that, I get many emails asking me to verify or authenticate ancient mosaics that clearly are confections that are made to look ancient, but clearly aren't. So Jim plays on this too. So Evidence of Night, and then Sugar Smacks from a series all about sort of favourite breakfast cereals of the 70s, 60s and 70s, but against an ancient backdrop. So this is a well-known backdrop from the House of the Golden Bracelet and Pompeii, and you get this very nice sort of, let's say, mix of ancient and modern. But he's probably most famous as the Pothole Man in Chicago. I'm beginning to see heads nodding, which again I think is a really nice, so here we have hard surfaces, we have holes being filled in. To create hard surfaces, he's played a lot with that hard surface, calling them potholes, then numbering them. Chicago, I think, has a particular pothole problem, and so numbering them ridiculously, so number 2,576, when he's done about 8 or 12 or something. And then obviously, this one on the right, which is this is not a pothole, and then in small writing anymore. They last for certain amounts of time, and he's been working on his technique to make them last longer. And I had the good fortune, we met in Los Angeles, and he was at that time doing a series called The Fanciest Pothole, where he was doing Gucci and other potholes. We laid together this Burberry one, which is very close to the Getty Villa, where we were giving some talks together. And again, sort of this has that very nice sort of play between the sort of gritty, dirty road and the fancy, high-class Burberry design. And, you know, that ancient in the modern can be found all over the place, and I could talk for a long time about various examples. I just picked those ones because I thought that they were immediately interesting. I wanted to move a little bit to production, and I have 5 minutes to sort of try to wrap this all together. I guess when I was thinking about production and the past, I was thinking about the individuals and the groups working together, the sort of mosaics that are written on, that speak to us over time, these lovely ones from the late Roman world in Tunisia, these two both identified by a mosaicist called Sabinianus Seniorianus as having painted and made them. The one on the top left for a bathhouse, which then tells you to go and wash well. You know, so it speaks to you and tells you what to go and do. But these mosaics full of pride, even if to us they may not seem like the highest quality. But other mosaics that we can really sort of relate to, those that tell us about the difficulties that they had in making them, which I think anyone who's been involved in making mosaics can understand exactly those difficulties of production. And the complexity within making, I think, that comes down to the present day, you know, as we all think about how to deal with particular contexts, whether making mosaics for schools outside or inside and so forth, where these layers of knowledge that are required to try to make things last over time. And again, these are two mosaics that show people working together. The one on the left, probably a mosaic of two mosaicists, perhaps a master and a son or apprentice, and then the one on the right, where they're bringing together all the building materials required for producing probably a large-scale public building, but actually showing that in the mosaic itself, probably in the building in which these people were working. So there's these sort of layers of what it means to put yourself within the project that you're actually doing. Which sort of brings me on to just that final bit that I wanted to say about this question of communities of practice and networks of knowledge and learning. And I think, for me, I'm very fortunate to have been involved in a number of meetings like this one. I mean, I'm super excited that BAMM has been coming to King's since 2013, on and off, of course. And, you know, I love this image of Gary, you know, on the video, the excitement, the gasp as he breaks this in half is palpable. So I think I wanted to just, you know, think about how we do engage, how we do share knowledge, how we do create networks between us. And I'll just show you a few very quick slides because I'm at 30 minutes. Just to show you how we might do that. So meetings, outreach and engagement, workshops and classes, and experimental archaeology. And I'm not saying these are the only ways, these are just those small things that I happen to get up to. So, working with schools, which I've seen fantastic projects that I've been partly involved just coming to talk about mosaics. But this one, for example, at the Iris Project and Cheney School, all the exciting things that went on at South Bank Mosaics, which is now going on at the London School of Mosaic, which I've also had the good fortune to be partly involved in and doing some teaching there. Work that I've done with Tamara, Julia, both of whom are here, and Gary Drossel, Chris, who's here, and Alessandro Lagari, putting on workshops out of which we've created series of videos to try to share knowledge or sort of begin a conversation about how to make things or why things are made in particular ways. And with that, even thinking about using various ways of recording how knowledge is changing. So these were questionnaires that we did at that event that just tracked very simply how, in a small way, workshops like this could make an impact on people's knowledge and skill levels. Very small, but important and incremental. And here is the mosaic with Chris himself, and the mosaic itself that now is in my department in King's with information about it, that students go and look at it and engage with it and come and ask me, what on earth is this thing, and why is it now hanging in our department? But also, really crucially, I think, is about thinking about when I'm in my office and sitting there with my computers, is how to understand the experience of making, what it is like, how we share that experience. And the micro sculpture makers sort of tend to bring up sort of quite good things like this. They write, say, Willard Wiggins, who makes these tiny sculptures, says, so to make these things, you have to be a dead man working. I make myself as rigid as possible. I hold my breath. I squeeze my fingers to stop the pulse from causing too much of a tremor. Then I work between my heartbeats. And why this is important to me is because it is about trying to get beyond simply documenting what it is like or how things were made, to understanding what that experience of making is like. And that's why I take so much pleasure in working with craftspeople, to really try to understand why they do things, what the intuition, the experience tells them, what the body knowledge learnt over years, how they then use that to form and make stuff. And I think that relationship is very important and very interesting to me. The sort of intuitive, haptic, and tacit knowledge that so rarely comes into at least my academic sphere. Generally, we look at books, we read inscriptions, we know they work collaboratively, but we rarely then go out and understand these are footprints of a collaborative making process used for the ancient Lod mosaic. But rarely do we get out into the wild and actually have a go at making things. So those workshops are really important to me, but also making things. This was just a playful thing that I did with Julia Vogrig, where we just sort of had a go at making some different sort of ancient-looking mosaics. So I guess what next? Well, I think, what do you think? What do we want to do next? How do we better collaborate and communicate our practices, our knowledge, and how do we build those networks? And I think, there is enormous value in creating and sharing our knowledge and deepening the networks that we have between us. And it is important to reflect on the nature of these networks and how we can make them better in the future. I think, for me, the ancient provides a lens that can provide a deeper understanding of traditions and processes. But the past, like the present, is not a static thing. It is continually being reappropriated, and it remains my job, and yours if you want it, to see our mosaic history as one that can be used highly effectively to examine our present. In other words, ancient mosaics, and all that may entail, are and can be an active part of contemporary practice, and can cast afresh in new mosaic projects, or at least that is the challenge. Thank you.